Okay, class, we are going to start chapter 9 today, which is about the self-adjusting economy. Sounds a little funny, but this is what Adam Smith was talking about when he talked, or part of what Adam Smith was talking about when he talked about the invisible hand. Um, Again, a funny phrase, what does that mean? We're going to talk about what that means today, but it's going to be very important. Um, the view that an economist takes about the self-adjusting economy is going to be very important in informing how they would like to see fiscal policy approached and monetary policy approached, and just policy in general approached. What does the self-adjusting economy refer to? Well, all economists believe in a self-adjusting economy. They might disagree over the length of time it takes to self-adjust or whether policy can help, but all economists believe in a self-adjusting economy, and the reason for that is we see it in the data. Okay, so again, we needed to have all the previous chapters in the bank, so to speak, before we covered the self-adjusting economy, because you have to understand some terminology, and you need to understand our basic ASAD model. But if you recall from chapter 7, I believe it was, when we talked about real GDP and potential GDP, and you've seen a graph like this before, where this yellow line is potential GDP, and the blue line represents what we actually got for real GDP. If you recall, sometimes we're below our potential, sometimes we're above. And the oscillation between these peaks and valleys is what we refer to as the business cycle. Okay? This chart represents the difference between real GDP and potential GDP from 1960 to 2017. Okay? Here's one a little bit zoomed in. Sorry, it's a little blurry here, but from 1990 to 2010. Again, you see periods below, periods above. Okay? But with both of these graphs, there seems to be some type of natural force, if you will, that when GDP is above potential, moves it back towards potential, and when GDP is below potential, that moves it back towards potential. Again, this graph is from 1960 to 2017. So we have different presidents, different control over the House of Representatives, Republican, Democrat, different control of the Senate over this time period, Republican and Democrat presidents, okay? Even within those parties, different views of fiscal policy, different views of monetary policy. We have different Federal Reserve regimes, Fed chairs appointed by Democratic presidents, Fed chairs appointed by Republican presidents, different Board of Governor members, which we'll talk about later in the class. But there, with all that change in potential policymakers, both fiscal and monetary, we still see this tendency for real GDP to approach potential. We don't see something that looks like this, you know, where here's our potential line, potential GDP, okay, and real GDP kind of falls off the cliff or shoots above and never comes back, okay? We don't see either of these disasters, okay? Why is that? Well, it's because of the self-adjusting economy, and we're going to go through that today. So we're going to go through the three states of the economy, the three states that the economy could be in, and the self-adjustment process that will take place. If you recall from chapter 8, we talked about long-run equilibrium, okay? Long-run equilibrium is going to be the equilibrium we get when the economy is completely at rest and no more self-adjustment takes place. Okay? So let's go through this, okay? We're going to start in a short-run equilibrium that is not consistent with a long-run equilibrium, okay? and then talk about the process that moves us to that long run equilibrium. All right? So let's imagine that we are in a short run equilibrium, and that short run equilibrium is below our potential GDP. Okay? So here's our potential GDP that we labeled QN in the last chapter. Okay? It's our long run aggregate supply curve. But our current equilibrium in the short run, where the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve intersect, falls below that potential. So Q0 is below potential. Okay? And here's our corresponding price level. We're going to call this a recessionary gap. And oftentimes I'll just call it a below full employment equilibrium. These are kind of interchangeable. You might hear both of these in the news. Okay? They might say we're in a recessionary gap. Maybe just a recession, although it's not exactly the same thing. Okay, but some people will use that terminology. Or a below full employment equilibrium. Okay? Now, in this state, and again, we've already discussed this, but just as a review, in this state, where we're in this short run equilibrium, below potential, the unemployment rate is currently greater than the natural rate, right? We're producing less than our potential, so unemployment is higher than the natural rate, okay? And real GDP is less than potential, okay? So what's going on here? We're producing less than potential. So another way of stating that is resources are being underused, okay? Resources are being underused. Well, why are resources being underused? Why would producers use less resources than what would be efficient? Well, the answer, generally speaking, is resources are overpaid. Now, how did we get in this scenario? We'll talk about that more later, okay? But resources are currently being overpaid, okay? So they're underused, underutilized, okay? Resources are overpaid, so they're underused, they're underutilized, okay? And in the short run, input prices are fixed by contract. Okay? So in the short run, input prices are fixed by contract. So there's nothing we can do about this in the short run. Okay? So we're producing less than potential. That means we're underusing resources. Why are we underusing resources? They're too expensive. Well, why don't we fix that? Well, in the short run, we can't because we assumed input prices, resource prices, are fixed by contract. Again, we covered this in the last chapter when we talked about the assumptions in the short run. One of the assumptions in the short run was that nominal input prices are fixed. Okay? But the short run isn't forever, and contracts don't last forever. Okay? Contracts are of a fixed length. Nobody signs a lifetime contract. Okay? I wouldn't want to sign a lifetime contract at EKU because I'm not even though I'm an economist, I'm not 100% sure what inflation is going to be going forward. So if they just said we would pay you X amount for a certain period of time, say that my lifetime, I'm not sure if that'll be a good contract 10 years from now. Remember, we saw this with post-World War I Germany, where prices exploded. So you could have gotten paid 3 or 4 times what you were worth at the beginning of the contract, but by the end of the contract, you couldn't afford a loaf of bread. Okay, so contracts don't last forever. Okay? So what we will see is that there's an adjustment in the long run. In the long run, in this situation, okay, where resources are underused because they're overpaid, okay, in the long run, contracts expire and will be renegotiated. Okay. Now, what will they be renegotiated at? Well, let's think about this. Okay. The owners of resources or inputs want to be paid, so they want what they're worth or more. Okay? The owners of resources want their resources to be paid what they are worth or more. Okay? Those that purchase resources, right? Those that purchase resources, who are these people? These are the businesses, right? These are the households. Okay? Those that purchase resources, what are they willing to pay? They will pay, what are they willing to pay? They will pay what they're worth for resources. They'll pay what resources are worth or less. So when the contracts expire and are renegotiated, what's going to happen? They sit down at the bargaining table and the owners of resources say, hey, you need to pay our resources, and they're not going to use this terminology, but in their mind they're going, listen, we'll accept what they're worth or anything more. Would prefer more, but we'll accept what they're worth. We will not accept less than they're worth. Those that purchase resources, namely businesses, go to the negotiating table and they say, listen, we want to pay as little as possible. We'll pay what they're worth, but would rather pay less. But there's no way we're paying more than they're worth, right? So they negotiate, and where's the only place they can come to an agreement? What they're worth, right? That's the only place where they can come to an agreement. They'll sit down and sign a contract when they're being paid what they're worth. Now, in this case, what's going on? We said resources were overpaid. So when they come back to negotiate, sure, they'd like to continue to be overpaid, but they also don't want to be out of work, and they got the contract is expired. And they say, hey, listen, we're willing to pay you nothing, okay, but you won't accept that. The most we're willing to pay is what you're worth. So the most they're willing to pay is what they're worth. The least they're willing to accept is what they're worth, but that's the only place where they can agree. So if they're currently being overpaid, what has to happen? In this case, nominal input prices will decrease, okay? Resource prices decrease. So if we're talking about labor, it's going to take a decrease in the nominal input price of labor. If we're talking about capital, it's going to decrease the nominal input price of capital. If we're talking about, something more specific like crude oil prices will have to come down. Okay? All right, so what will this do to our graph? Okay? Let's look at it. All right, so let's look at the long run adjustment graph. So here we are. This is the same graph as the previous page, right? We're below full employment. Here's our price level. Here's our quantity. It's below potential. Potential long run aggregate supply is to the right of Q0. Okay? We got the same graph here. Okay? P0, Q0 below Qn. Okay? We're underproducing. Why? Because resources are overpaid. We're stuck in a contract. But what happens in the long run? Recall when contracts expire, nominal input prices are going to have to go down. So resources are paid what they're worth. No more, no less. Okay? Well, what happens when nominal input prices go down? You should remember from chapter 8 that this is one of the shift factors of the short run aggregate supply curve. So this, if input prices go down, producers can produce more. This will increase short run aggregate supply and shift it to the right. Okay? Now, a very important question is, how far will it shift it to the right? Well, let me use a pencil here because I'll need to erase it. Here's SRS0. Okay? What if it shifted it to here? Okay? Maybe I should draw that a little darker, but I'm going to erase this. Okay? What if it shifted to here? And again, you might want to do it in pencil too, because we're going to erase this. What if it shifted it to there? Well, where would our equilibrium be? Here. Here's where our new Q would be, right here. Where is that? It's below potential. What does it mean to be below potential? We're producing less than we could if we produced efficiently. Why are we producing less than we would if we could efficiently? Because our resources are overpaid. Wait a minute. You mean when contracts expired, people renegotiated contracts? Businesses in particular renegotiated contracts so they'd continue to overpay resources? That doesn't make any sense. So they're not gonna renegotiate contracts and continue to pay them more than they're worth. That's not what's going to happen. Well, maybe it'll shift it to here. Okay? Maybe it'll shift to here. And here's our new equilibrium here at Q1. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to find out in a minute here, but at the risk of stealing my own thunder, we're now overproducing. What does overproducing mean? It means we're using our resources too much. When would that happen? When resources are underpaid. Do you mean we just renegotiated contracts and households agreed to be underpaid, paid less than they're worth? They signed that contract voluntarily without a gun to their head? No, that's not going to happen. We said that they're going to agree to a contract where they're paid what they're worth. No more, no less. Businesses are happy to pay less, but households won't accept it. Households are happy to accept more, but businesses won't pay it. So how far is this going to shift to the right? To here. Here's our new equilibrium at P1, Q1. Okay? P1, Q1. Exactly potential GDP? Really? Yes. Okay? Yes. Resources want to be paid what they're worth or more. The people who buy resources want to pay what they're worth or less. The only place it makes any sense at all for contracts to be negotiated to is paying them what they're worth. So we'll use them efficiently at our potential. Really? Are you serious? Yes, and we see it in the data, right? We move back towards potential. Now, things happen, but every time we move away from potential, there seems to be something that's moving us back to potential. What is that something? That something is resources want to be paid what they're worth or more. The purchasers of resources want to pay them what they're worth or less. And whenever we get to a point where we're over or underpaying resources, they get renegotiated to move us back towards what they're worth, using resources efficiently. Okay? And so in the long run, I put my abbreviation for interest rates on for some reason, but in the long run, real GDP equals potential GDP. The unemployment rate is going to equal the natural rate of unemployment. And now prices no longer want to adjust. Right? So we've gone from P0 to P1. Once we're at P1, there's no more long-run adjustment. We're here. We're at what resources are worth. Okay? So prices no longer want to adjust. So really, we've achieved our 3 goals. Okay? How did we do it? Did the government get involved? No. Did Congress pass a stimulus package? No. Did the Federal Reserve change the money supply? No. Have we altered tax policy? No. There's no government involvement here at all. This is just people wanting to be paid what they're worth or more, and businesses want to pay resources what they're worth or less. And the only place we can come to an agreement is paying resources what they're worth, so we're going to use them efficiently and generate a real GDP that's equal to potential. Okay? Sounds far-fetched, but it's in the data. There it is. Okay? You see it with your eyes. Okay? And we've seen it since we've been collecting data. Okay? All right, well, let's do this again, and I'm going to give you a chance to kind of quiz yourself on this. All right, let's look at an inflationary gap. And again, I'll often just call this above full employment equilibrium. Okay? Above full employment equilibrium. All right, what I want you to do right now is pause this video and draw a short run equilibrium in an inflationary gap or above full employment equilibrium. So go ahead and pause this video and draw that inflationary gap graph yourself. Okay, hopefully you're back now. One good way to kind of do this is, although the last one was kind of built for you ahead of time, I'll show you how I kind of draw these. I like to go ahead and know where potential is. So I draw my long-run aggregate supply curve first if I was required to do this, okay? And so I know where QN is. There's potential, okay? There's potential. Well, we're going to be above full employment or above potential, okay? That means my equilibrium is going to be to the right. So oftentimes I'll just go ahead and put my equilibrium point there. I know that equilibrium point, right? So that is going to be my P0 and my Q0. Okay, I've already picked my equilibrium point. And then I draw my upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. I'll call that SRAS 0, okay? And my downward sloping aggregate demand curve. I'll call that AD 0. And there's my equilibrium point. Okay, so your graph should look like that. Okay? All right, so I'm going to have you pause the video again here for a second. And I want you to tell me, and you can do it with a symbol here, what's the relationship between these two? Greater than, equal to, or less than? Greater than, equal to, or less than, the relationship between these two. And then I want you to circle the correct answer. Are resources overused, underused, or used efficiently in this short run equilibrium? And then maybe briefly tell me why. So go ahead and pause the video and answer these questions. Okay, if you've unpaused the video here. So we're producing more than our potential. Maybe I could have asked this one first. I kind of like to answer this one first. But real GDP is greater than my potential. Q0 is above QN. Well, if I'm producing more than my potential, then the unemployment rate is going to be artificially low, lower than the natural rate, less than the natural rate. Okay, if real GDP is above potential, then I'm overusing resources. Resources are overused. Okay? And when would businesses overuse resources? When they're artificially inexpensive, right? So they're underpaid. How did, say, workers or capital get in a situation where they're underpaid? Well, we can talk about that more later, but they can't do anything about it right now because it's fixed by contract in the short run, right? Okay, so they're underpaid, but this is fixed by contract in the short run. But the short run's not forever, okay? Most people nowadays have maybe 1-year contracts, either explicit or implicit. I have an explicit 1-year contract each year that I sign. But a lot of you probably have worked at places where there's an implicit contract. And it's usually only about 6 months or so. And what's the implicit contract? Maybe you get hired somewhere and they say, hey, in 6 months you'll be up for review. What that basically says, in 6 months we'll review your performance and we may change what you get paid then. And you can either accept it or not, okay? But you know, hey, we're not going to change it for 6 months. We want to observe you. But eventually something will happen, okay? So what will happen? I want you to, again, pause this video. What's going to happen to contracts? As a result of what happens to contracts, what's going to happen to nominal input prices? As a result of what happens to nominal input prices, which direction will the short-run average supply curve shift? Okay? And then after that shift, right, so we're going to answer the question, how far? And you don't really have to answer that question. You'll answer it by answering these questions. What's the relationship between real GDP and potential after the shift? What's the relationship between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment after the shift? And what are resources going to be paid after the shift? Okay? So go ahead and pause your video again, okay? And based on what's going to happen to that graph, answer those questions. Okay? Okay, hopefully you're back and you've answered these questions correctly. What are the correct answers? Well, contracts will expire. They're going to run out. And I might add, and be renegotiated. Okay? So they're going to expire and be renegotiated. Now, in this case, okay, right, in this case where resources were being underpaid, what's going to have to happen to those input prices, right? Resources underpaid, what's going to happen to those resources? What's going to happen to those inputs? Nominal input prices will increase, right? Again, it's in this case where we have a inflationary gap, okay? And resources are overused and underpaid. In this case, nominal input prices will have to increase after those contracts expire. And so an increase in nominal input prices are going to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve in which direction? To the left. Okay? How far? Well, we're going to shift it to the left. We're not going to shift it to here because that would mean the equilibrium is here and resources are continually underpaid. Households aren't going to agree to continually be underpaid, right? They're not going to sign that contract. And it's not going to shift over here because then our equilibrium would be below potential. And resources, we've already gone through this case, resources would be being overpaid and underused. And businesses aren't going to agree to overpay resources when they just had an opportunity to sign a new contract. So where's it going to shift to? How far? Until we've achieved a new equilibrium that is equal to potential. So Q1 is equal to Qn. And here's our new price level P1. Okay, so in this new equilibrium, okay, real GDP is equal to potential. Right? The unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate. That's what happens when real GDP equals potential. And resources are paid what they are worth. Okay? What they are worth. No more, no less. Okay? Now we're back to long-run equilibrium, right? This supply curve is gone, okay? This supply curve is gone. We are in equilibrium here at potential GDP on our long-run aggregate supply curve, okay? So in a sense, we've achieved our three goals, right? Real GDP equals potential. The unemployment rate equals the natural rate, okay? And now prices no longer want to adjust. They've taken care of things, okay? So prices are stable, okay? All right, we said there's three states of the economy. We've described two, but actually that's not true. We've described all three, okay? So the third state of the economy is a full employment equilibrium or long-run equilibrium, which we've already depicted, okay? So again, I want you to pause the video and I want you to graph on your own a full employment equilibrium and then answer these questions. What are resources paid in this equilibrium? How are they going to be used, okay, in this equilibrium? What's the relationship between real GDP, potential GDP, the unemployment rate, and the natural rate? And you might tell me what's going on with prices, okay? So you can answer the question about how are we doing with the three goals, okay? So go ahead and pause the video and do that yourself. Okay, again, just to give you an answer key here, I like to draw my long run supply curve first. So there's my long run aggregate supply curve. So this is where QN is. And then I know for full employment equilibrium, my equilibrium is going to have to occur on that long run aggregate supply curve. So I draw my upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. I draw my downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And so here we are at P0 and Q0. Okay, so resources are paid what they're worth. No more, no less. Resources are used efficiently. They're not overused or underused. Real GDP is equal to potential. The unemployment rate equals the natural rate. Prices do not want to change. That's why it's an equilibrium, a long-run equilibrium. Prices do not want to change. So in terms of our three goals, yes, yes, yes. Okay? Now, let me just talk a little bit more about our three goals here. So yeah, prices don't want to change. Price stability, check. The unemployment rate equals the natural rate, check. But what's our most important goal? We want high, sustainable economic growth, right? High, sustainable economic growth. Well, when real GDP equals potential GDP, that is sustainable. Okay, check. But what about the high growth part? Okay, what about the high growth part? Well, we want to increase potential GDP over time. So we want real GDP to equal to potential GDP, but we want potential GDP to grow over time, okay? And so we want economic growth in potential. And we're going to talk about this more in the next chapter. I think this is chapter, let's look here real quick. In my edition that I'm using, it's chapter 17. And we'll talk about that chapter next, okay? So that'll complete our analysis of the three goals that we have for the economy. But for right now, these three goals are being achieved when we're on our potential GDP line. Okay? All right, I want to work through a question that I'll sometimes get, okay, as an economist. that you may have even had yourself. Okay, so sometimes if I'm at a dinner party or something, and somebody finds out I'm an economist, especially if maybe they've had a couple libations, not too many, but just enough to loosen them up a little bit, they might ask me, and they'll usually phrase it something like this: I know this won't work. I know this isn't a good idea, but why couldn't the government, they'll usually say, but what they really mean is the Federal Reserve, but why couldn't the Fed just print $1 million and give it to everybody? I know that wouldn't work, but why wouldn't that work? Okay, and if I have a cocktail napkin at the ready, uh, I can answer it with a graph. If not, I can describe it. Okay, and now you can too. Okay, so let's answer a similar question. You could really, at this point, answer this question yourself with maybe a little guidance here. So here's the question. The economy is currently at full employment, let's say, long-run equilibrium. And then the Fed decides to print money to give to every American. Okay? What would happen in the short run? What would happen in the long run? Okay? So let's talk about this. Let's talk through this. Okay? And this will answer the question, how do we get in that situation where we're overusing or underusing resources? All right, so the economy is in long-run equilibrium. It doesn't want to change, right? Prices are stable. Q0 equals Qn. There's no inflationary gap or recessionary gap. So the economy is happy right here. It doesn't want to go anywhere. It's long-run equilibrium. It's at rest. But then someone has the bright idea of printing $1 million for everybody at the Fed and handing it out, stick it in your mailbox. Okay? Now listen, if the Fed was wanting to print $1 million and stick it in only my mailbox and nobody else's, I would certainly be for that policy because it would improve my life. But we don't want to be victims of the fallacy of composition. Okay? So what's right for what is helpful to an individual may not be helpful to a society. Okay? In this case, if they gave everybody $1 million, what would that do? How would that affect our model? Well, at first, so in the short run, what would this policy do? What would this policy do in the short run? Right? It would increase consumption, increase investment, right? People would buy houses, cars, right? Which that's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay? Shifted to the right. Now, before they do that, I want to show you that the price level is P0. So you signed a contract at work that says, how much you're going to get paid per year, and it's paying you what you're worth, right? So let's say that contract buys you a bag of groceries a day, right? That's what you're worth, a bag of groceries a day. So whatever your paycheck says, that paycheck is going to buy you a bag of groceries a day. If the price level is P0, your paycheck will buy you a bag of groceries a day. But now this policy comes out, okay, and aggregate demand shifts to the right, okay? Let's say aggregate demand shifts to the right to AD1, huge increase in aggregate demand, okay? From this $1 million everyone has and runs out and buys cars and TVs or whatever else, okay? Look what's happened now. So yes, we are going to be producing more than potential for a period of time. We're at Q1. But what's happened to the price level? It's jumped by a whole bunch. In my example, it looks like it's doubled. Now what does your paycheck buy you? Just your paycheck. I'm not talking about the money shoved in your mailbox, okay? What does that buy you? It buys you, if prices have doubled, it buys you a half a bag of groceries, right? It buys you a half a bag of groceries, okay? Now, you're stuck in this bad contract because you signed a contract back here to be paid what you're worth, but you thought the price level was going to stay at P0. But what's happened? This silly policy has now doubled prices, and your paycheck doesn't buy a half a bag of groceries, or buys a half a bag of groceries. Now, eventually your contract's going to expire, right? So businesses love the fact that, hey, wow, we're now getting, a Coke used to be $1. Now I sell my Coke for $2. And I still don't have to pay my labor anymore. I'm just paying them the same paycheck that buys them, what used to buy them a bag of groceries only buys them a half a bag of groceries. And they can't get out of it because they're in a contract. But I'm selling Coke for $2 a can now instead of $1. Okay? What's going to happen? In the long run, okay, in the long run, contracts expire. And you say, hey, listen, I'm going to need to be paid what I'm worth, okay? Well, if you're being underpaid, right, resources are overused because resources are underpaid, what's going to happen to your nominal input prices? They're going to have to go up. They're going to have to go up until what? Until you're paid what they're worth. Paid what you're worth, right? So, short and aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. And now we're in our new long run equal. You can call this Q2 if you want, okay? You can call this P2, okay? Well, Q2 is just equal to Qn, it's Q0, right? So we're back to potential. We haven't produced anymore. We're producing the same amount of stuff. All we've done is dramatically increase prices. And now it'll stop, okay? Now, I've made this look really nice and neat, okay? But don't forget, there's going to be some abrupt changes here. And remember, we talked about unanticipated inflation can really hurt people, right? This is inflation much higher than we anticipated. So it's going to hurt workers, okay? It's going to hurt workers, all right? And actually, oftentimes, we don't see a nice, smooth transition, right, from one to the other, right? We had a little bit of a bubble here, and it caused a huge burst, okay? Again, you see a bubble and a burst here, okay? You see a bubble and a burst, which often happens, okay? Sometimes it's not as bad. Here's a bubble, not so bad of a burst, okay? But here's not that much of a bubble with a big burst, okay? So it can take a while to oscillate, so it's not as clean as I have it drawn here, okay? It can take a while, and it can hurt people in the interim, okay? But did you make people better off? Are they going to be able to consume anymore in the long run? No. Real GDP is just back to potential. And again, if there's a bubble burst, what you know, the Roaring '20s lead to the Depression of the '30s before we get to potential in the late '40s. Okay, 1940s. So this is the best case scenario. And what did you do? Nothing but increase prices. Okay. So we're just going to go from this point to this point on the long run aggregate supply curve with no increase in production in the long run. Okay? I wanted to show you, this is a graph, instead of this graph, which shows our potential, and our potential does increase from year to year. This graph from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis shows this zero line is potential. So they want to show you fluctuations around potential with potential as a zero line. That's sometimes how it's presented. So how much plus or minus we are off of potential. So if you're not off potential, you're at zero. If you're above potential, you're plus, right? 0.02, 0.04, 0.06. And this is in billions of dollars, okay? And if you're below potential, you're in the minus, okay? If this isn't fully accurate, but one way to look at this adjustment here, right, from potential, right, we went above and then back to potential. I could just turn this graph on its head in a way, right? Here you can think of this in a way as your long run aggregate supply curve, and here's movements back and forth, okay? from things happening. Often silly policy. Oftentimes, the fluctuations around potential are caused by bad policy. And again, this is one of the reasons why Adam Smith and classical economists say, policy often does more to hurt the economy than help. So let's not engage in it. Okay. All right. So oftentimes these upticks or downturns are caused by bad policy. This one right here in particular, the 2008 crash, was caused by bad policy that started back in the 1970s with the Community Redevelopment Act. Okay. In the 70s, we passed a Community Redevelopment Act because we didn't like how many people were buying houses, right? So we said banks got to make more loans to people that they wouldn't typically loan to. Well, that was passed in the 70s, but we didn't really have any policies in place that said, well, if banks aren't doing what we want in terms of giving loans to more risky people, then there's nothing we're going to do about it. We're just telling them we'd like them to. Well, by the 1990s, we gave that policy some teeth, and we said, well, if you don't make loans to people that don't typically qualify for loans, we're going to penalize you. And even still, banks didn't make loans to risky people because they said, listen, we'd rather pay the penalty than have people default on our loans. So by the 2000s, they basically said, okay, here's what we'll do. You banks go make risky loans that you don't want to make, and you'll make money up front on the loan. And then you can sell the loans to a pseudo-government institution, Freddie Mac and Sallie Mae Corporation, which are really government institutions, and we'll buy those loans for you. So we'll hold the risk and you can make the profits. And what happened was this worked for a while. It even caused some of the bubble that we experienced. But then when there was a little bit of a downturn in the economy, people stopped making their mortgage payments because they were bad risks to begin with. And all of these mortgage-backed securities that were through the entire financial system collapsed. Okay? So really, essentially, this terrible collapse can be linked to bad policy. Just like this collapse, right, is caused by bad policy. Okay? In this case, it was a bubble, but that bubble is going to have to burst. Okay? But the bubble was caused by bad policy. Okay? All right, so just a little bit on self-adjustment and economic thought. Again, we've talked a little bit about this already, but this self-adjustment finds its roots in classical economic theory, which a lot of people would say would go back to Adam Smith. But again, we know, and just like Joseph Schumpeter pointed out, this kind of classical view is really founded a lot in the late scholastics. Okay, so the economy will self-adjust quickly. Why? Because prices adjust quickly. That's the underpinning reason. Okay, why will the economy self-adjust quickly according to classical economists? Because prices adjust quickly. Okay, and for a classical economist, that would include all input prices. Okay, and this is basically the justification for a laissez-faire approach to government. The government shouldn't be too involved in the workings of the macroeconomy. Now, the classicals didn't use a model like we use today, but if we were to use our current model to describe the classical view, it would have looked something like this, where here's the aggregate supply curve at potential, and here's our aggregate demand curve. Okay? And if there's any price level above, like a PTH, price too high, that's going to create a surplus that will be quickly adjusted. If there's any price level too low, where there's a shortage, the quantity of real GDP demand is greater than the quantity of real GDP supply, that's going to create a shortage that will put upward pressure on price until a price level is established that will clear the market. P0 will clear the market, and QN will equal our real GDP. Okay? Now today, all economists believe in self-adjustment. All economists believe in self-adjustment. Okay? Why? Because It is in the data. You cannot deny its presence in the data, okay? So all economists believe in self-adjustment. Now, they might disagree on the time it takes for the adjustment. Some economists think it's going to be pretty quick. Some economists think it could be a little slow. And you can see that that would affect how you view policy. The quicker it'll self-adjust, the less likely you want to use government intervention. The slower you think it is to adjust, the more likely you might be to use a little bit of government intervention. And they also might disagree whether or not the policy can help. So even if you think it might adjust a little slower than some economists, you still might not want to use policy because you think policy might not be as effective or effective at all. Okay? So that's going to affect your view on policy. But we're going to need to keep this in mind, this self-adjustment, okay? This is going to be something we're going to have to keep in mind for the rest of the semester, okay? After chapter 17, we're going to transition to kind of what I would call the second half of the material anyway. This is kind of the end of the first half. Chapter 17 is kind of a transitional type of chapter, and then the rest of what we cover is going to involve different views of policy, both fiscal policy and monetary policy. But self-adjustment is going to be our benchmark. Okay, do we think this type of fiscal policy or monetary policy is going to do a better job than if we just let the economy self-adjust? Or do we think it will do a worse job than if we just let the economy self-adjust? So this is going to be our benchmark. This is going to be our ruler for policy going forward. Okay? And we'll stop there for today. We'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.